75 years ago, as U.S. troops joined the Allies in World War II to bring fascism to heel overseas, our government unconstitutionally incarcerated more than 100,000 Japanese Americans right here at home. What did that look like, and what are its lessons for us today? Ahead on Wide Angle. Today's Wide Angle falls under the heading, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." For, just as the Trump team mulls over the wisdom of a Muslim registry, we observe the 75th anniversary of one of this country's darker hours, the internment of Japanese Americans after the bombing of Pearl Harbor and America's entrance into World War II. Helping me explore the Japanese American incarceration is Richard Cahan, a noted photo historian and former photo editor at the Chicago Sun-Times, as well as the co-author of the new book, Un-American, The Incarceration of Japanese Americans During World War II. Welcome to Wide Angle, Rich.
Thank you, Peter, very much.
So let's transport ourselves back, if we can, Rich, to 1941, December, for the benefit of the viewers to sort of remember what was going on at the time, yeah? The war has been fought in Europe since Germany invaded Poland in 1939. Japan and China have been fighting in the Pacific since 1937. The U.S. very intentionally was staying out of both of those conflicts. Yeah? Then December 7th comes. Japan attacks the U.S. fleet in the Pacific at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The next day, December 8th, President Roosevelt speaks to the American people as well as Congress, and Congress that same day declares war on Japan. Where does this leave those of Japanese ancestry who are living particularly on the West Coast?
The Pearl Harbor had a huge impact on Japanese Americans, especially in California. I talked to many survivors of camps, and they talked about how on that they remember as children their parents watching or listening to the radio and hearing the reports, and the parents were always very concerned about what happened. The kids didn't understand it, but they knew that this was going to complicate their lives. Yeah. On Monday, the kids started to understand it because in school, and there's many accounts of this, their friends started to keep away from them, and as they walked down the halls, there was oftentimes almost like waves separating so that they could walk down. People didn't want to be near the students. So life was very different. It was a day of infamy for all Americans, but it was particularly the start of years of infamy for Japanese Americans.
Right. So comes February 19th, 1942, I believe is the date. President Roosevelt signs Executive Order 9066, leaving authority, and I'll do a little quoting here, over the lives of any and all persons from prescribed military areas, and actually the American West was a prescribed military area then, leaves the responsibility of those people in those areas to the Secretary of War and his military commanders. Can you tell us a bit about Executive Order 9066 and how it really changed the landscape for Japanese Americans in the American West?
Well, it was remarkable in that the president was leaving the fate of people of Japanese ancestry up to the Army. Yeah. The Army's job was to secure the country. The president's job was to look out for the civil liberties of citizens living in the country. And in a sense, he was saying, I'm not going to look over their civil liberties. I'm going to leave this up to the Army. The Army's decision was very easy. When asked how to best secure the country, it was easy to say, let's isolate this population, let's concentrate them in certain areas, and the quote problems will go away. Right. It's ironic that there were no problems at that time. Even the Attorney General, Francis Biddle, admitted that there is no acts of sabotage, there was no evidence of collaboration, but because the Army was in charge, that's what happened.
Right, and that's exactly where I was hoping we would go. So between December 7th, 8th, 9th,
11 weeks.
Yep, right, exactly. To March, when the internments began effectively. We've got, 11 weeks, 3 months roughly, where 110,000, I think was the number that you cited in the book, 110,000 people of Japanese ancestry, 70,000 of whom, by far the majority, of whom were actually American citizens. Yeah, they were, I believe, American-born children of first-generation Japanese parents.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So certainly the 70,000 are people who we would all agree should have the protection, the full protection of citizenship, constitutional rights, due process of law. And as you say, there is no finding of any acts or any attempted acts of sabotage of the American war effort in favor of Imperial Japan, right?
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Interestingly, that worked against Japanese Americans. Earl Warren, who was the Attorney General of California at the time, drew a map showing where every Japanese American lived, and then he drew maps of power plants and ports and radio towers and airports, and he showed how close they were to all these things. When he was questioned by Congress, and they said, well, but there's been no acts of sabotage, there's been no evidence of wrongdoing. And he said, exactly, it proves to you what's going to happen because they're so secretive that they're laying low in a sense. So their good behavior, their responsible behavior was used against them.
Gracious. So let me shift a little bit, because certainly at the open of this segment, people might have found a discontinuity a little bit. I spoke of internment of Japanese Americans, which is the focus of your book, and yet I read aloud the title, including the subtitle of the book, which speaks to incarceration. Yeah, certainly the way that most Americans have learned this piece of history is through the internment.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think there is an entire vocabulary that has evolved to maybe soften what was actually going on at the time. And you speak to it directly in the book. Words such as the evacuation of Japanese Americans, their relocation to assembly centers. Yeah? Certainly many Japanese Americans at the time took issue with that vocabulary. Yeah? Felt it did not accurately reflect what was going on. Why is that, in your estimation, and what vocabulary maybe better situates what was going on at the time?
Well, I think the words that we've used over the last 6 or so decades, over 75 years, don't only soften what happened, but they really paint a inaccurate picture. Mm-hmm. You and I can't be interned. We're U.S. citizens. Okay. We can be jailed, we can be incarcerated, we can be detained, we can be put in custody. But internment is a word that's only used for people from another country living in that country at the time of war. Okay. So there were people who were interned, and they were literally still citizens of Japan. Right. They fall into a special group here because they couldn't become U.S. citizens. Some of them had lived in this country for 40 or 50 years. There was no way they could become U.S. citizens because laws prevented it. Right. So internment is obviously one word and that we did want to use, and we were going to use it because it's the familiar word. And as people know, when they write things, keywords are important. And if you look up Japanese internment, my book doesn't show up because it's interesting. But we talked to many people who were survivors of the camps, and they said, "Why do you want to start your book with a lie?" Mm. That was an argument that we didn't have a good answer for, so we used the word incarceration. But other words too. They were taken to temporary detention facilities, which are always called assembly centers. Uh-huh. Now think of a moment. Assembly center connotes parades and patriotism, and let's all get together on the village green. Mm-hmm. This wasn't an assembly center. Right. Even the word camp is something that it could be argued it certainly wasn't a camp. Mm-hmm. It wasn't a camp-like experience. Mm-hmm. These were truly concentration camps in the basic definition, and that was a word that was used even in the 1940s. Right. Obviously, because of what happened in Europe, right. that connotes other things. These were not death camps.
Right, right. I should note, and you speak a little bit about having conversations with Japanese Americans who lived through this. I should note there are certainly loads of ways that we could have talked about the book. Yeah, it is a book that is replete and really focuses on photos from that era taken by Dorothea Lange, the photographer of the migrant mother, which is an iconic image in American photography. Ansel Adams, who at the time was considered one of the foremost landscape photographers in the country, and others who, through the War Relocation Act, administration, I believe, were employed to take photos of the various. I'll call them camps only between us, right? So there are loads of photos, but you also did, you tracked down original photo subjects who are considerably more aged now. This is 75 years on, or relatives. Yeah. So you did a significant amount of research work to not only get the photos, but to get the stories from the source as well. Yes?
Yeah, ultimately this book is a visual history.
Yeah.
Pictures really matter. There's been great novels written about the incarceration. There's been great nonfiction books, but pictures bring us back to exactly what happened.
Right. Now, one of the really difficult parts of this story to understand, I think, is the fact that by and large, the Japanese American community was not challenging Executive Order 9066, and we're just left to wonder why would they not challenge such a law?
Well, there's many reasons. One of them is everything moved very fast. We talked about it only took 11 weeks for the whole machinery to start, and things were happening quickly. And Japanese American families were in trauma. Yeah. The FBI had picked up thousands of heads of households, anybody who donated to Japanese causes or taught Japanese language. They had a list all ready to start picking up people. So their finances were frozen. So they were just trying to get through the days. Right. But also there's a tradition in Japan of not questioning authority, of following authority. Yeah. And I think that many people thought that this was their responsibility. Or the war was starting to rage, and this was what they could do to the war effort, to follow the rules.
Interesting. Okay, let's take a brief break there, if we can, Rich, and we'll invite viewers to join us on the other side of this public service announcement. We'd love to hear your feedback. Email us at wideangle@acmi.tv. And if you'd like to hear more about this or other Wide Angle episodes, visit us online at acmi.tv/wideangle. Okay, Rich, so first half, we were sort of giving people a sense of what was going on as of December 7th, 8th, 9th, and into the beginning of the incarceration of Japanese Americans. What I'm sort of interested in sort of delving into now is what was going on and what was the response of neighbors of these people who were being removed from communities that, as you said, they may have lived here for 30, 40 years. What was the response of neighbors, of the country as a whole, to Executive Order 9066?
Well, I wish I could give more positive news on the response of neighbors. Most of the response was on the West Coast. Mm-hmm. Obviously, that's where the problem was. That's where Japanese Americans lived. Right. And on the whole, neighbors didn't stand up. There was a feeling that there was a jealousy of Japanese Americans. They owned usually small plots of land, They raised strawberries, but then they did very clever things. Farming techniques they brought it from Japan. They would grow strawberries between the grapes. And so instead of having a harvest every 5 years, a grape harvest every 5 years, they have a harvest every year and then a grape harvest every 5 years. Wow. And they did this primarily because they worked very hard. Every member of the family worked the farm, and they could do things like this. And there was a jealousy, There was a fear. I had a chance to read many local papers, and there were very few letters to the editor, very few people standing up. There were many editorials that said this is important and we need to do it, and it might solve the Japan problem. So Americans, this was not their shining moment in California. Outside of California, I don't think people were that involved. It wasn't a red state, blue state. It was really a West Coast and the rest of America situation.
Interesting. We spoke of the War Relocation Authority previously. They had built both temporary holding areas, camps, again, which is an inaccurate word, but for the sake of the conversation, as well as more permanent facilities where people would live for an extended period of time, as it in fact happens that it was the duration of the war. Were the more permanent facilities more concentration camps, which you suggested Japanese Americans at the time referring to them as, or were they sort of small American towns, which was the way that the government was sort of framing what they were like on a day-to-day basis?
The government made it sound like these were communes and this was going to be an adventure, and they put out pamphlets saying that you should be sure to wear your Western garb in your frontier adventure. It was none of that. These were enclosures that had high barbed wires. They had soldiers that manned towers with machine guns and guns, and they had searchlights. The temporary facilities were usually in county fairgrounds or at racetracks. Santa Anita was one of them. Hastily built barracks were built for these people, and some people lived in horse stalls, literally horse stalls. They joked that these places were good enough for Secretariat. Maybe they should be good enough for themselves, but it was a frightful situation. There was no privacy in the communal bathrooms. The food, there was no attention to the Japanese diet in the mess halls. People got sick. They got lonely. They were separated from their friends very soon after. There were friends that came and visited, but they were kept out, and they literally had to visit at the barbed wire gates. And then they were taken away. They were taken away to places that they had no idea where they were taken to. They were taken to very undesirable places of California. They were put on Indian reservations in Arizona, taken to Arkansas, which was a 5 or 6 day train ride. These were places that nobody wanted to live at, but they happened to be on railroad spurs, so they didn't have to build tracks to take them.
Interesting. It falls particularly hard on young people who are in the midst of trying to establish a life, and all of a sudden being removed to this distant outpost.
It falls hard on many different age groups. Actually, if you were in college, you had the opportunity to find a college out east or in the Midwest and go to college, and that was an incredible program that was set up privately. But if you were in your 50s or 60s and you were taken away for 3 or 4 years, there was no way you could come back and establish yourself. The only little group that seemed to benefit from it were young kids. All of a sudden, their parents were around. Their parents who had been working the farms for 24 hours a day were all of a sudden around. They had loads of friends from the community. They played baseball. When you talk to young people, many of them will say that it was really something of a camp experience. If you ask them about their family, they will tell you generally how their family disintegrated and how their parents were. So they were taking people who were just in the prime of their life sometimes and just starting businesses. Businesses had to be given away and sold. The equipment had to be sold. So it was devastating.
Right. Okay. So let's fast forward to near the end of the war. Public Proclamation 21 allows Japanese Americans to leave incarceration camps and go anywhere in the country that they'd like. Certainly some decide to go back home, to go back to the communities that they were removed from. Others decided that they'd make a new start of it and headed east. What did both of those groups find? What was the tenor in the country, and what sort of welcome did they receive?
Well, we should talk about why the camps were open. They were open because the case finally wound its way up to the Supreme Court, and the court was on the verge of deciding that this was illegal and immoral. Franklin Delano Roosevelt knew that, and the day before the courts were going to actually make their decision, he opened up the camps. So this was in late 1944,
Okay, right.
and it took almost half a year to a year to actually really empty the camps. Many people didn't want to go back to California. They had very bad memories of California, their neighbors, the response, their property was gone. Sometimes they had stored their property in the basement of Buddhist churches or in warehouses, and a lot of that was vandalized. So there was no great desire to go back to California. Many of them, there were certain areas of the country that the War Relocation Authority did help people literally relocate to Chicago and New York and stuff and cities like that. But interestingly, they were told that they should disperse. They shouldn't be together because there was still a feeling that Japanese Americans were tight-knit communities. And of course, they were tight-knit communities, like any immigrant communities. You stay around people who know your languages. But they, that's one of the reasons why there's not a large amount of Japan towns outside of San Francisco and Los Angeles and, other California communities too.
Yeah. Interesting. At the time, what sort of reparations did the government make or not make? What efforts were made and amends for this executive order?
Well, not much. In 1952, Japanese Americans were finally allowed to become citizens of the United States, the first generation. That was done because the Cold War had started, and we were gearing up for wars against communist countries, and we wanted to make sure that Japanese people, in a sense, would be on our side. And I'm always surprised what a large percentage of people who had lived through this whole thing did become citizens. I don't know if they did it for practical reasons, they knew the value of citizenship, or they still loved America. I think probably both.
Right.
But it wasn't until the late 1980s that reparations were finally offered. An apology by President Reagan, and everybody who lived through it was offered a $20,000 check.
Okay, and you're specifically now speaking about the findings, I guess, of the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians that happened in 1980. Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
And this commission, finally in 1982, after years of study, released a report that basically said the United States was in a sense conspired to round up Japanese Americans with no due process, and they attributed it to race prejudice, to war hysteria, and interestingly, they attributed it to the failure of political leadership.
Well, and there's an interesting point, isn't it? I gather 1943, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt goes to an incarceration camp and immediately starts crusading to close the camps. Any sense as to whether or not her husband, President Roosevelt, ever saw signing Executive Order 9066 as a mistake of his presidency?
There's no real proof that he ever saw that. And as Eleanor said, it's very hard to correct mistakes. Mistakes are easy to start and very hard to correct.
Yeah. Interesting. I imagine one of the findings of the commission that you spoke of, the 1980 commission, was something along the lines of never again. We will not do this again. Yeah, but here we are. We have an incoming president and his administration that is exploring the efficacy, if not the constitutionality, of a registry for Muslims. In your estimation, are those two things similar? Is the incarceration and a registry similar? And do you have any thoughts as to how Americans who might find the registry contrary to what it is that they'd like the country to stand for might resist it this time, as opposed to go quietly?
Well, there's a direct relationship between the registry and the incarceration. In fact, the incarceration started, in a sense, with the registry. Before they picked them up, everyone had to register. And by registering, that made it possible. The machinery started. There is talk there's been talk by people on Fox News that the registry is constitutional. It's interesting because that debate came up in 1941 and 1942, and the Justice Department basically said, "We'll make it constitutional. We'll figure out a way to make it constitutional." And of course, it wasn't constitutional. Eventually, the Supreme Court was going to decide on this. So the words are the same.
Yeah.
And many groups in the Japanese community, especially in San Francisco, see this relationship, and they're starting to rally and really show allegiance to Muslim Americans.
Yeah. Rich, is there anything else that we haven't spoken of today that you feel would be important to leave viewers with on this subject?
Well, I think it's just important for people to understand the power of pictures. And the photographers, Dorothea Lange and Frances Stewart, and even Ansel Adams, they were all very aware of the political consequences, and they were aware that they were leaving something important in history. Mm-hmm. And it's thrilling to be able to be on the receiving end and take a look what they left behind, right, and then figure out what all this means. And it's been a real privilege to find people to explain these photographs, and it's just in the nick of time, because in 25 years there'll be so few of these people left, and it's important to put it on paper. Right. So I think that people will get a lot out of this book. The pictures are artistically beautiful. Mm-hmm. They're historically important. Yeah. And now the stories that are surround the pictures are very, it's very important to memorialize this.
Right. Well, I thank you for your time, Rich, to talk with me today, and viewers.
Thank you.
And thank you for certainly collecting the photos, for putting them in between covers, for the loads of research that you did in collecting stories from the people who lived them. I think that's vital, and I hope that our conversation today, as well as people looking in the book, will open an important door to a piece of our history that's often overlooked.
Thank you so much. I
Absolutely.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. We started this conversation with the words of philosopher George Santayana. We end it with those of Father Martin Niemöller, a German pastor who, like the Japanese Americans we've discussed today, spent the war years imprisoned. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out, because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. For Richard Cahan, I'm Peter Bermudez. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Wide Angle.